I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we're going to be looking at the 1960 class of films. I can't believe we've already done the 60s, but we're going to jump into a few more episodes of the 50s. We won't cover all of it, but this is sort of the final decade that we'll be covering in full on the series. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I look at a film that was nominated for Best Picture that I think has been forgotten or lost to time. A movie that hasn't sort of stayed in terms of film history or film culture, or hasn't been recommended to me in various ways, whether it be a podcast or sort of searching the internet. A film that maybe just has maybe seen as one of the 5 best movies of the year, but over time has lost or has maybe been dated or whatnot. But I try to answer that question. I try to answer and try to figure out why it's been forgotten. I'm seeing many of these films for the first time, so I give my thoughts on the film, but also I think it's very crucial to understand the history, why this was nominated at the certain time, and what the certain time period and sort of the taste of Hollywood at its time, because the Academy is directly related to Hollywood, especially during this time. The taste that they have it's so crucial to what films they kind of nominate, where the taste maybe have changed, or maybe a film that has sort of stayed with that trend, that trend no longer exists and was much more, say, a fad than it was a sort of historic moment in film. But so in order to understand the Oscar history, I talk about the 5 other nominees and the relation within one another and the relation within the Oscar history. So if you're an Oscar fan, you'll like the Oscar history, but if you're more of into my other series, let's be like Masters of Controlled Chaos, where I do sort of an in-depth analysis, you will pretty much, you should enjoy this one as well, because I think I do sort of delve into that. But this week, we're going to be looking at Elmer Gantry. So jumping into the 5 nominees, the one film that I could have done was The Apartment. This was the eventual Best Picture winner. It was a movie that once it had sort of critical acclaim in the summer, it almost in a lot of ways was destined to get at least a Best Director win, if not the Best Picture win, because Billy Wilder was nominated, the director and writer of this film, who had already won for Best Director and Best Picture in 1946, or I guess the film was nominated in 40, the film was released in 45, but the last weekend he won for that. So people thought, okay, he's had his due, but throughout the 50s, he was nominated 9 times. It seems like every time he released a movie, people were nominated for either screenplay or actor, or getting that director nomination, and a lot of times picture. So when the 60s came around and he released The Apartment, it was sort of just like, okay, enough. We've nominated this guy 9 times in the 50s. We hadn't given him any wins in the 50s. He's a clear phenomenal filmmaker, a favorite of ours. Let's give him that Best Picture win, that Best Director win. Well, I briefly talked about it on my Billy Wilder Masters of Controlled Chaos video. It's not necessarily one of my favorites, but I had seen it. It is a classic, and within Billy Wilder fans, it's one of his most acclaimed films, I would say. And another film that was nominated here was The Alamo, directed by John Wayne, starring John Wayne, or at least partially. This is sort of one of the big sort of over-budget, heavily campaigned Oscar movies. You know, people think, oh, the Oscars are so much about money and politics. You know, nowadays it's corrupt. But when you look at this, it's like this is a clear definition of the Oscars always being about campaigning. John Wayne launched a sort of historic campaign from all the history and sort of the newspapers at the time. It was very much seen as he sort of put out the word that if you didn't vote for this movie, you were unpatriotic and you were un-American, and this was the most expensive movie ever made on American soil by this sort of proud American John Wayne. And then a lot of people probably voted for this movie even though they hadn't even seen it, which I have a feeling still goes on today. But this was definitely a passing project of his. And while it made some money, was so expensive and was so over budget, he wasn't able to control the set. That was the reason why he didn't direct more films. But he had someone like John Ford who came in and tried to help him for a bit. That some people think is, he helped onto that, but sort of all reports seem to lead that he was sort of just visiting and did some sort of second unit stuff, you would say. But that was sort of a nominee that was a surprise nominee, but because of the heavy campaigning and that nobody wanted to seem unpatriotic, they voted for The Alamo. Another film here is Sons and Lovers, similar to Elmer Gantry, based off a controversial best-selling book, where Elmer Gantry is sort of about religious heresy, and that was sort of a controversy. This book is very much about sort of sexual explicitity, and shows how much it was the writer devolved about his own sort of personal life and got into details in a lot of ways. And so this is, of course, the movie based on the book, actually directed by John Cardiff, who is an acclaimed cinematographer, did The Red Shoes, Black Narcissus, did a lot of Archer films, and also actually did last week's film, Fanny. He didn't direct that, but he did the cinematography for that. So this is one he actually directed. And I haven't seen it. I didn't find too much information about it, but I do think it's sort of interesting that this is sort of the controversial book here in a lot of ways, and that this was a film that I'm not necessarily sure it's definitely been remembered, but it did get a nomination. The other film here we have is The Sundowners. This is by Fred Zinnemann, who is sort of a well-respected filmmaker we talked about briefly last week, but he really is one of those guys where he has made so many movies, but you've probably seen some of his movies, but you never really talk about him. He's sort of a disrespected and an unremembered filmmaker in a lot of ways, but he is one that is definitely connected to time, but not necessarily seen as an auteur or as a great director. Of course, he has a movie like Day of the Jackal, which is very connected to the 70s conspiracy era, and then he has From Here to Eternity, which is sort of seen as this big first sexual movie in terms of its sort of beach scene, which was groundbreaking at the time and sort of an expose in a lot of ways. He did sort of High Noon, which is this Hollywood subversive sort of left-wing kind of a film that snuck into sort of the motion picture code era, especially in a time when the Red Scare was at an all-time high. So he does these really unique different films. I haven't seen The Sundowners, but I do want to check it out and understand more of Fred Zinnemann's career, because even though I'm sort of looking back at all his films, he's one of those guys that sort of just slips in and out of the radar. He does get his Oscar wins. He had A Man for All Seasons. He does sort of get respect in that sense, but for some reason or another, his films just hasn't been as well remembered, and he hasn't as well. His films actually have been remembered, but he hasn't sort of a director hasn't been as well celebrated as some of the other sort of major people from this time. But the film we're going to be looking at today is called Elmer Gantry. Like I said, based off a controversial book. I actually think that this was sort of a really interesting year to pick, because I would say maybe 4 out of the 5 nominees were forgotten. I wouldn't say The Alamo, Sons and Lovers, The Sundowners, or Elmer Gantry were like, you've got to see this. This is one of the best. This is one of the best of the year. Mainly because there's a lot of films that sort of weren't nominated, that were sort of transcendent films of this year. It wasn't just a bad year for movies. It was actually quite a good year for movies, but the movies that were released were so groundbreaking that other films didn't necessarily get the love they got. But of course, this is from writer-director Richard Brooks, who's well known for his adaptations. Of course, he adapted Tennessee Williams in Count on Hot Tin Roof. He also did In Cold Blood, Truman Capote's film, or Truman Capote's book. He adapted that film. And it stars Richard Burton as sort of Elmer Gantry, this role that was sort of coveted and wanted by a lot of actors, but Burt Lancaster has sort of been for a few years now starting to be sort of the lead in a lot of his films, a great sort of young up-and-coming actor, seeing this sort of adult, mature, middle-aged kind of role that he tackles, and eventually wins him an Oscar for this film, and I think rightly deserved. So transitioning to my thoughts, if you don't know, it's about a con man. Well, I guess maybe not necessarily a con man, but a man who is trying to influence people through a gospel and preaching, but not necessarily adhering to those sort of faith-based sort of guidelines and rules and morals that he sort of preaches on an everyday basis, trying to use religion as a business, which is a theme that we sort of often have tackled. Most recently, one of the, I think, the greatest films of the 21st century, There Will Be Blood, very much looks at sort of that dynamic. But this one, all the way in 1960, very much having that aspect, has some incredible performances. The theme, of course, you have Shirley Jones, who sort of does this Mary Tyler Moore-esque subversion of her character, which eventually wins her an Oscar. Then you have Burt Lancaster, which gets his Oscar. But then one of my favorites, Gene Simmons, who I've always loved since The Big Country. She's one of my new sort of favorite actors as I sort of explore more of her roles. She's really phenomenal in this, and I think both her and Richard Burton are my two standouts just because they're able to do sort of big, large preaching, sort of fantastical, almost over the top, ultra enthusiastic, charismatic sort of sermons, but also in their private lives when they're sort of talking about things, there's all these sort of quieter moments, or these sort of moments of unassuredness or unsure what to say next, and getting caught up in the moment. So many times they get caught up in the moment, but then they're not supposed to be lovers because they work together, so there's sort of this conflict. I was really impressed by this movie in terms of its themes, this general theme of using religion as a business, and is it morally okay to say sort of these subsections of religions, if it's getting people to Christianity, how much can you sort of stretch the limits of Christianity to fit into this sort of business model? They say, very much so that, religion is a business, but of course you don't want to be like that. You just want to do it sort of out of the good of your heart. It's a timeless sort of contradiction. This is one of the earliest films that I've seen that really tackles it in a head-on way. And with these sort of standout performances by the trio of actors there, really just impressed me throughout the film, and sort of the dualities of the film while also tackling these interesting themes. Really brilliant. One of my favorites for sure of the forgotten Oscar films sort of catalog. But why has this been forgotten? Like I said, sort of alluded to before, this was the same year of Psycho and Breathless. And I think those are two landmark cinematic films. Breathless, there's very much sort of these cinema verite, French New Wave, of course, seminal film, the French New Wave, of how it sort of changed films and how films are shot and how film was referenced, and then Psycho, of course, being very inventive and game-changing in terms of how it sort of changes protagonists and how the story structure of both films, really, and how it's plotted, are so sort of different and unique that's unseen before. And you watch a movie like Breathless, and then you watch a movie like Elmer Gantry, and you can feel like Elmer Gantry is sort of a time, despite being very interesting. It's very made into a certain mold, that the way Breathless is very much free and unique and jazzy and very much French New Wave and very much modern in that sense. So it's sort of maybe forgotten. Some of these other films have been forgotten because when you're teaching a film course, what do you talk about in the 60s? You talk about this period where Breathless came out and Psycho came out, and it was completely different afterwards. And films were able to do different things, and the art form, in a sense, was able to evolve and grow. That these films maybe, like Elmer Gantry, while very interesting, just the technicalities, how they told their story, weren't necessarily inventive or incredibly new, which is hard to do with something like Psycho or Breathless, that they weren't that sometimes they get degraded in a lot of ways, which is unfortunate because Elmer Gantry is a really good movie, and I think you should check it out. But make sure you comment below. Let me know some of your favorite movies from 1960. Have you seen Elmer Gantry? Have you seen any of these nominees? And which ones have been your favorite? I'd love to hear it in the comments down below. That's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. And until next time, stay tuned.